The bus never came. Michael Thompson pressed his back against the glass shelter, watching the digital display flicker between delayed and out of service as rain hammered the streets of downtown Seattle. He should have grabbed his umbrella from the office, but the morning forecast had promised clear skies. Weather apps lied as much as people did. A movement caught his eye through the sheets of rain. Someone sat hunched on the far end of the bench, shoulders shaking. At first he thought it was just the cold, but then he noticed the thin cotton dress clinging to a slight frame, completely soaked through. Hey! He moved closer, recognizing the signs of hypothermia from his volunteer work at the shelter. You okay? She looked up, and something twisted in his chest. Dark hair plastered to her skull, a thin scar running from her left temple to her jawline. Eyes that seemed too old for her face. But those eyes, something about them made his breath catch. I'm fine. Her teeth chattered so hard she could barely get the words out. Michael shrugged off his coat without thinking, the same way he'd done 1,000 times for homeless clients who refused help until their pride couldn't keep them warm anymore. No, you're not. She tried to push the coat away. I don't need charity. It's not charity. It's Tuesday. He wrapped the wool around her shoulders anyway, noting how she seemed to disappear inside it. Besides, my grandmother would haunt me if I let someone freeze while I stayed dry. Despite herself, she pulled the coat tighter. Your grandmother sounds like she meant business. Still does. She's 92 and lives in my building. Keeps threatening to outlive me just to spite my mother. Michael sat down beside her, far enough away to seem safe, but close enough to share body heat. I'm Michael. She hesitated. Anna. The name didn't fit her somehow, like a borrowed jacket that was the wrong size. But people had reasons for calling themselves whatever they wanted. He'd learned not to ask too many questions. Well, Anna, unless you're planning to grow gills, we should get you somewhere warm. He pulled out his phone. There's a coffee shop 3 blocks down. 24 hours, decent food, and they don't mind if you camp out for a while. I can't afford coffee. Good thing I can. She studied his face as if looking for the catch. Most people on the streets had learned to be suspicious of kindness. It usually came with strings attached, or worse. Why would you do that? Michael considered the question. 6 months ago, he would have said it was simple human decency. Before he'd started working at the shelter, before he'd learned that most people walked past suffering without blinking, before Emma's anniversary had started eating him alive again. Because 8 years ago, someone helped me when I needed it most. And she's not around anymore to pay it forward herself. Something shifted in Anna's expression. For just a moment, she looked like she wanted to say something important. Then the moment passed. Okay, but just until the rain stops. They walked the 3 blocks in relative silence, Michael holding his jacket over both their heads while Anna clutched his coat around herself. She moved carefully, like someone who'd learned not to trust her own balance. When they reached Grind Coffee, she hesitated at the door. I look like a mess. Everyone looks like a mess in Seattle. It's basically our city motto. The warmth hit them immediately. Anna found a corner table while Michael ordered 2 large coffees and whatever pastries hadn't gone stale. When he returned, she was staring out the window with an expression he couldn't read. Thank you. She wrapped her hands around the coffee cup like it was a lifeline. I mean it. Don't mention it. He pushed a blueberry muffin toward her. You waiting for someone? At the bus stop, I mean. I thought I was. But I think they forgot about me. There was something in the way she said it that made Michael think she wasn't talking about tonight. He wanted to ask more, but she'd already done him the favor of accepting help. Pushing for details would cross a line. They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, watching the storm rage outside. Anna ate the muffin in small, careful bites, like someone who wasn't sure when the next meal would come. Michael pretended to check his emails while really studying her reflection in the window. There was something familiar about the way she tilted her head when she was thinking. Something that made his chest tight with a feeling he couldn't name. But that was impossible. He'd never seen this woman before in his life. When the rain finally eased to a drizzle, Anna stood up. I should go. The buses are probably running again. Michael stood too, not ready for her to disappear back into the night. Do you need fare? I'll figure it out. She started to take off his coat, then stopped. This is yours. Keep it. I've got others. She looked like she wanted to argue, but the practical need for warmth won out. I'll find a way to return it. Don't worry about it. Anna headed for the door, then turned back one more time. Michael? The person who helped you 8 years ago. I hope you see her again someday. Before he could respond, She was gone, swallowed up by the Seattle night like she'd never existed at all. Michael stood there for a long moment, staring at the door and trying to shake the feeling that he'd just let something important slip through his fingers. Again, Michael woke up screaming. The nightmare was always the same. Emma's car flipping end over end down the ravine, metal shrieking against rock, and him running toward the wreckage knowing he was already too late. But this time, when he reached the twisted remains, it wasn't Emma's lifeless body he found. It was Anna, her dark eyes staring up at him with that same familiar expression he couldn't place. He sat up in bed, sweat cooling on his skin despite the apartment's warmth. 3 nights in a row now. 3 nights since he'd given his coat to a stranger and felt like he'd met a ghost. The clock read 4:17 a.m. No point trying to sleep again. Michael pulled on running clothes and headed out into the pre-dawn darkness of Capitol Hill, his feet automatically finding the route he'd run every morning for the past 8 years. Past the coffee shop where he'd first kissed Emma. Past the bookstore where they'd spent entire afternoons reading to each other. Past the corner where she'd said yes when he'd fumbled through a proposal with a ring he'd bought with 3 months' worth of overtime pay. The route always ended at Lakeview Cemetery, where a headstone marked Emma Rose Collins, beloved daughter, sat among the other permanent residents of Seattle's grief. He'd stopped bringing flowers after the first year. Emma had always preferred living things to cut bouquets anyway. But today, standing in front of the granite marker, Michael found himself thinking about Anna's hands wrapped around that coffee cup. The same long fingers Emma had used to paint watercolor landscapes that somehow captured more truth than photographs ever could. The same way of holding herself like she was protecting something fragile inside. "This is insane," he said to the headstone. "She's dead, and I'm losing my mind." The morning joggers were starting to appear by the time Michael made it back to his apartment building. Mrs. Chun from 4B was already in the lobby, checking her mail with the dedication of someone who still believed good news might arrive in paper form. "You look terrible, Michael." "Good morning to you too, Mrs. Chun. I'm serious. When's the last time you took a vacation? Saw a movie? Went on a date?" She fixed him with the look that had probably terrified her children into becoming successful adults. "Emma wouldn't want you living like a monk." The comment hit harder than usual. Emma's been dead for 8 years. Exactly my point. Mrs. Chin tucked her mail under her arm and headed for the elevator. Dead people don't need caretakers. Living people do. Michael's phone was ringing when he got upstairs. The caller ID showed his architectural firm's main number, which meant someone had gotten to the office before him. Probably Janet, his project manager, who treated tardiness like a personal insult. "Thompson, we've got a problem." Janet's voice carried the particular edge that meant a client was about to make his life difficult. "The Riverside Theater project. The Preservation Committee is demanding an independent assessment of the interior murals before we can start demo." "What kind of assessment?" "Art restoration specialist. Someone who can determine if there's anything worth saving before we gut the lobby." Papers rustled in the background. "I found someone who can start today." Lisa Martinez recommended her. Michael paused. Lisa Martinez was a private investigator he'd used for background checks on potential contractors. Good at her job, terrible at small talk, and exactly the kind of person who would know where to find specialists in obscure fields. "Fine. Set it up." He hesitated, then made a decision that probably qualified as temporary insanity. "Actually, can you give me Lisa's direct number? I need to hire her for something else." An hour later, Michael sat across from Lisa Martinez in her cramped office above a Korean barbecue restaurant. The smell of grilling meat mixed with coffee and cigarettes, creating an atmosphere that somehow felt both comforting and ominous. Lisa looked exactly like she had 5 years ago when he'd hired her to investigate a contractor who'd been overcharging clients. Sharp-featured, skeptical, and completely unimpressed by whatever story people brought to her door. "You want me to reinvestigate a closed case from 8 years ago?" She didn't bother making it a question. "Your girlfriend's car accident. Fiancé. And yes. Why now?" Michael had been asking himself the same question. Because he'd met a stranger who reminded him of a dead woman? Because his nightmares had suddenly gotten worse? Because Mrs. Chun was right about him living like a monk? "I met someone a few nights ago. She looked like Emma. Moved like her. Even held her coffee cup the same way." He felt ridiculous saying it out loud. "I know how that sounds. It sounds like grief playing tricks on you." Lisa leaned back in her chair, studying him with the expression she probably used on cheating husbands and insurance fraudsters. Happens more often than you'd think. Maybe, but I need to know for sure. What exactly do you think I'm going to find? The police investigated. There was physical evidence. Witnesses saw her car go over the guardrail. I want you to look anyway. Lisa named a fee that would put a serious dent in Michael's savings account. He agreed without negotiating, which seemed to surprise her more than anything else about the conversation. All right, but I'm going to need you to stay away from this Anna person while I work. If she really is just someone who happens to look like your dead fiancé, the last thing she needs is you projecting 8 years of unresolved grief onto her. Michael wanted to argue, but Lisa was probably right. He was already walking a thin line between hope and delusion. Getting involved with Anna would only make things worse for both of them. One more thing, Lisa said as he stood to leave. If I find what you think you want me to find, are you prepared for what that might mean? Because sometimes dead people stay dead for good reasons. Michael didn't have an answer for that. But as he walked back to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that somewhere in the city, Anna was asking herself the same question. The Riverside Theater smelled like decades of forgotten dreams and fresh paint primer. Michael pushed through the heavy lobby doors, blueprints tucked under his arm and a toolbox in his free hand. The restoration project was supposed to take 6 weeks, assuming the preservation committee didn't find any surprises worth throwing tantrums over. In his experience, they always found something. Scaffolding already covered the east wall, where someone had set up an easel and work lights. Paint tubes and brushes lay scattered across a folding table like surgical instruments waiting for an operation. The art restoration specialist Janet had hired was apparently an early riser. "Hello." His voice echoed off the vaulted ceiling. "I'm Michael Thompson, the architect. Up here." Michael looked up to see a woman balanced on the scaffolding 20 feet above, a paintbrush between her teeth and what looked like a magnifying glass in her hand. She was studying a section of mural that depicted angels dancing around a harvest moon. It was Anna. The brush fell from her mouth and clattered against the metal platform. For a moment, they just stared at each other across the empty theater lobby. Then Anna seemed to remember where she was and carefully climbed down the scaffolding. "You're the architect." She wiped her hands on a paint-stained apron, leaving streaks of ultramarine blue across the fabric. "I didn't expect. Janet didn't mention." "She didn't mention what?" "That you were." Anna stopped, shook her head. "Nothing. I'm sorry. I'm being weird." She was wearing his coat. The wool had been cleaned and mended where a small tear had been near the left pocket, but it was definitely the same one he'd wrapped around her shoulders 3 nights ago. Seeing her in it made something warm and painful twist in his chest. "You kept it." Anna looked down at the coat like she'd forgotten she was wearing it. "I tried to find you, to return it, but I realized I didn't even know your last name." "Thompson. Michael Thompson." He set down his toolbox and unrolled the blueprints across a dust sheet. "And you're the art restoration specialist Janet hired." "I am." "Anna." She hesitated. "Anna Foster." Another borrowed name. He was sure of it now, but he'd promised Lisa he wouldn't push, and Anna clearly had her reasons for guarding her identity. "Well, Anna Foster, looks like we're going to be working together for the next few weeks." "Looks like it." They stood there for a moment, both of them trying to pretend this wasn't the strangest coincidence either of them had ever experienced. Finally, Anna gestured toward the murals. "I hope you're not planning to tear these down. They're really quite remarkable." Michael studied the painted walls for the first time since entering the theater. The murals covered every surface of the lobby, depicting scenes that seemed to shift between religious imagery and pure fantasy. Angels with human faces danced alongside figures that looked more like woodland spirits than biblical characters. "I wasn't planning to, no? The preservation committee wants them assessed first." He moved closer to examine the brushwork. "Are they valuable?" "Not in terms of money. The artist wasn't anyone famous. But the technique is unusual." Anna climbed back up the scaffolding, and Michael found himself following. "Look at this section here." She pointed to a cluster of symbols painted into the border around one of the dancing figures. At first glance, they looked like decorative flourishes, but when Michael focused on them, he could see they were actually letters and numbers worked into the design. "YRC plus MJT." Anna traced the symbols with her finger. "Someone's initials, I think." And here, she moved to another section. The same initials, but with a date. May 15th, 2015. Michael's breath caught. May 15th, 2015 was the day he'd proposed to Emma. But that was impossible. This theater had been closed for renovations since 2010. Are you all right? Anna was studying his face with concern. You look like you've seen a ghost. I'm fine. Just those initials. They're familiar. Really? Anna's voice carried a note of excitement that seemed to surprise her. I've been finding them all over the murals. Always hidden in the decorative elements. Always paired with dates that seem significant somehow. She led him to another section where the same initials appeared alongside what looked like a small painted wedding ring. Then another spot where they were surrounded by tiny music notes. It's like someone was documenting a relationship, Anna said. A love story told in secret symbols. Michael felt like he was standing at the edge of a cliff. The initials were too close to be coincidence. RC could be Emma Rose Collins. MJT was definitely Michael James Thompson. But Emma had never mentioned painting murals in any theater, and she'd certainly never been inside the Riverside before it closed. Anna. His voice came out rougher than he'd intended. How long has this theater been closed? The records say 2010. But these paintings? She gestured around them. Some of the paint is much newer than that. This section here was definitely done within the last 10 years. That's impossible. I thought so too. But paint doesn't lie. Anna climbed down from the scaffolding again, moving with the careful precision of someone who'd learned not to trust their own balance. Someone had access to this building long after it was officially closed. Michael's phone buzzed with a text from Lisa Martinez. Found something interesting. Can you meet this afternoon? He looked up to find Anna watching him with an expression that was becoming familiar. Like she was trying to solve a puzzle, but was missing half the pieces. I have to go, he said. But I'll be back tomorrow to start measuring for the renovations. All right. Anna walked him to the door, still wearing his coat over her paint-stained clothes. Michael, those initials I found. If they mean something to you, maybe you should find out who painted them here. Maybe I should. As Michael drove away from the theater, he couldn't shake the feeling that Anna knew more than she was letting on. The way she'd traced those symbols, the excitement in her voice when she'd found the hidden initials, the fact that she was wearing his coat like armor against the world. Either he was losing his mind, or the woman he'd thought was dead had been hiding in plain sight for 8 years, leaving breadcrumbs for him to find in the form of secret paintings in an abandoned theater. Both possibilities terrified him equally. Lisa Martinez spread the police files across her desk like a dealer laying out cards for a high-stakes game. Crime scene photos, witness statements, insurance documents, and a coroner's report that had taken her 3 days and 2 favors to access. Your fiancé didn't die in that car accident, she said without preamble when Michael walked into her office. Michael had been preparing himself for this conversation since her text, but hearing the words out loud still felt like taking a punch to the solar plexus. He sat down heavily in the chair across from her desk. Explain. Lisa pulled out a photograph of twisted metal and broken glass scattered across a ravine. Emma Collins was reported dead at the scene. No body recovered due to the fire, but dental records from personal effects confirmed identity. I remember. Except the dental records were falsified. Lisa slid another document across the desk. I had a friend at the medical examiner's office run the original x-rays through current databases. They belonged to a Jane Doe who died 3 months before Emma's accident. Someone switched the files. Michael stared at the paperwork, the words swimming in front of his eyes. That's not possible. It gets worse. The car that went over the guardrail was reported stolen 2 weeks before the accident. Emma's actual car was found abandoned in a parking garage downtown 3 days later. Lisa lit a cigarette despite the no-smoking sign on her door. Someone wanted the world to think Emma Collins was dead. Who? That's where it gets interesting. Lisa pulled out a bank statement marked with highlighter. 3 days after the accident, Emma's trust fund was transferred to her uncle, Richard Collins. All $57 million of it. Michael felt like the floor was shifting beneath him. Emma never mentioned a trust fund, because she probably didn't know about it. According to the paperwork, it was set up by her grandmother and wasn't supposed to be accessible until Emma turned 30. That was supposed to happen 6 months after she died. So her uncle killed her for money. Not killed. Disappeared. Lisa stubbed out her cigarette and leaned forward. I think your Emma is still alive, Michael. And I think her family has been keeping her somewhere against her will for the past 8 years. The room went silent except for the sound of traffic outside and Michael's own heartbeat thundering in his ears. He thought about Anna's careful movements, the way she held herself like someone who'd learned not to trust the ground beneath her feet, the borrowed names and the familiar gestures that had haunted him since that night at the bus stop. There's more. Lisa pulled out a medical report. Emma Collins was treated at Harborview Medical Center 6 months ago, admitted under the name Jane Smith, but the attending physician noted old injuries consistent with long-term medical neglect, malnutrition, untreated fractures, signs of prolonged sedation. 6 months ago. Michael did the math. That's right around when Anna showed up in the city. Your theater friend? Lisa raised an eyebrow. You think she's Emma? I don't know what to think. Lisa gathered the files and slid them into a manila envelope. I'm going to keep digging. But Michael, if Emma is alive and her family has been holding her prisoner for 8 years, approaching her directly could put both of you in danger. These people have already committed fraud, kidnapping, and probably attempted murder. They won't hesitate to finish the job if they think their secret is out. Michael took the envelope with hands that weren't quite steady. What do you suggest? Let me handle the investigation. You stay away from Anna until we know for sure what we're dealing with. But as Michael drove back toward the theater, he knew he couldn't follow Lisa's advice. If Anna was Emma, if she'd been suffering while he'd been mourning her death, then staying away wasn't an option. He owed it to both of them to find out the truth. The theater was dark when he arrived, but Anna's car was still in the parking lot. Michael found her inside, working by lamplight in front of a section of wall where she'd carefully removed several layers of paint and plaster. You're back late, she said without turning around. I could say the same about you. Anna stepped aside to reveal what she'd been working on. Behind the painted mural, she'd uncovered a small hollow in the wall. Inside were dozens of folded papers, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. I found them while I was cleaning the paint buildup around the border. Someone hid these here deliberately. Anna's voice carried a strange note of excitement mixed with something that sounded like fear. They're letters. Michael moved closer as Anna unfolded one of the papers. The handwriting was feminine, flowing script in faded blue ink. My dearest M, Anna read aloud. I know I shouldn't be writing these, but I can't help myself. Every day, without you feels like drowning. I keep thinking about the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching, like I'm something precious you're afraid of breaking. Anna's voice caught on the last words. She pressed a hand to her chest, confusion flickering across her features. There are dozens of them, she said, all signed with just the letter E, all addressed to M. She looked up at Michael with eyes that seemed to be searching for something just out of reach. Reading them makes my heart race, but I don't know why. Michael took the letter from her hands, recognizing something in the handwriting that made his throat tight. Anna, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Okay. Do you remember anything from before you came to Seattle? Your childhood, your family, anything? Anna was quiet for a long moment, studying his face as if trying to read something written there in a language she'd forgotten. Fragments. Images that don't quite connect to anything. She touched the scar on her face unconsciously. I wake up sometimes feeling like I've lost something important, but I can never remember what it was. Michael pulled out his phone and scrolled through his photos until he found one from 8 years ago. Emma laughing at something he'd said, paint in her hair from the landscape she'd been working on, looking exactly like the woman who'd written those hidden letters. Have you ever seen this person before? Anna stared at the photograph for a long time. Then, without warning, she collapsed against the wall, both hands pressed to her temples. Anna, I can't. Her voice was barely a whisper. Every time I try to remember, it's like there's a wall in my head. But seeing her, reading those letters. She looked up at him with tears in her eyes. Michael, I think something terrible happened to me, and I think you're the only person who might know what it was. The Collins family estate sat behind iron gates in Bellevue like a fortress designed to keep the world out and secrets in. Michael had been there exactly once before, 8 years ago, when he'd asked Emma's parents for permission to marry her. They'd treated him like something unpleasant they'd found on the bottom of their shoes. Now, armed with Lisa's evidence and a rage that had been building for 3 days, he pressed the intercom button and waited. Can I help you? The voice belonged to someone trained to make visitors feel unwelcome. Michael Thompson to see Richard Collins. Tell him it's about Emma. The gates swung open with mechanical precision. Michael drove up the winding driveway, past manicured gardens that probably cost more to maintain than most people made in a year. The house itself was a monument to old money and older grudges. All stone columns and leaded glass windows that reflected nothing back. Richard Collins answered the door himself, which surprised Michael until he realized the man was probably trying to limit the number of witnesses to whatever conversation was about to happen. Emma's uncle looked exactly the same as he had 8 years ago, silver-haired, expensively dressed, and radiating the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having to face consequences. Michael Thompson. Richard's smile could have frozen champagne. This is unexpected. I'll bet it is. Richard led him through a hallway lined with family portraits that somehow managed to exclude any trace of warmth or affection. They ended up in a study that smelled like leather and lies, with windows that looked out over perfectly controlled gardens. Can I offer you a drink? I want to know where Emma is. Richard poured himself 3 fingers of what looked like expensive scotch. Emma is dead, Michael. I know that's difficult to accept, but clinging to false hope isn't healthy. False hope. Michael pulled out the envelope Lisa had given him and scattered the contents across Richard's antique desk. Is that what you call falsified dental records? Staged car accidents? $57 million in stolen inheritance? The color drained from Richard's face as he looked at the documents. For a moment, Michael thought the man might actually confess. Then Richard's expression hardened into something that belonged in a boardroom where hostile takeovers were planned over lunch. I don't know what game you think you're playing. Where is she? Even if Emma were alive, which she isn't, why would I tell you anything? You were never good enough for her. A working-class architect with delusions of adequacy. Richard sipped his scotch like they were discussing the weather. Emma's grandmother understood that. Why do you think she set up the trust fund with such specific conditions? Because she wanted to control Emma's life from beyond the grave. Because she wanted to protect Emma from making the same mistakes her mother made. Richard's voice carried the weight of old family resentments. Marrying beneath her station, throwing away opportunities, settling for mediocrity. Michael felt something cold settle in his chest. So you made sure Emma couldn't make those choices. I made sure Emma was safe. Safe. Michael laughed, but there was no humor in it. You kidnapped your own niece, faked her death, and stole her inheritance. That's your definition of safety? Richard finished his scotch and set the glass down with the careful precision of someone buying time to think. You're delusional, Michael. Grief has obviously affected your judgment. Then you won't mind if I take this evidence to the police. The police won't find anything worth pursuing. Emma Collins died in a car accident 8 years ago. Case closed. Richard moved to the window, hands clasped behind his back like a general surveying a battlefield he'd already won. But hypothetically speaking, if someone were to start asking uncomfortable questions about closed cases, they might find themselves facing legal difficulties. Harassment charges. Stalking. The kind of accusations that could destroy an architectural license. Michael stared at the man's back, understanding finally settling over him like a weight. You're threatening me. I'm offering friendly advice. Move on with your life. Find someone appropriate. Build a future instead of chasing ghosts. What did you do to her? Richard turned around, and for the first time since Michael had arrived, his mask slipped slightly. Emma was sick, Michael. Delusional. She needed medical care. Drugged. You kept her drugged. Medicated. Under proper supervision. Richard's voice carried the tone of someone justifying the unjustifiable. She's better now? Stable. She has a new life, a new identity. Why would you want to destroy that for your own selfish purposes? Michael felt the room spin around him. She escaped from you. Emma Collins is dead. Richard moved to his desk and pressed a button that probably summoned security. I suggest you remember that. The study door opened, and 2 men in expensive suits walked in. Not servants. Private security, the kind that specialized in making problems disappear quietly. Gentlemen, Mr. Thompson was just leaving. Michael gathered the scattered documents, his hands shaking with rage and something that might have been relief. Emma was alive. Damaged, maybe broken, but alive. Everything else was just details to be worked out later. This isn't over. Yes, it is. Richard returned to his scotch as if Michael had already ceased to exist. And if you're smart, you'll make sure it stays that way. Michael drove back toward Seattle in a haze of anger and determination. Richard Collins could threaten him all he wanted, but the man had made one critical mistake. He'd admitted Emma was alive. His phone rang as he pulled into the theater parking lot. Anna's number. Michael. Her voice was shaky, frightened. Something's happening to me. I'm remembering things, but they don't make sense. I need. She paused, breathing hard. Can you come to the theater? Please? Michael was already running toward the building before she finished asking. He found Anna standing in front of an easel she'd set up in the center of the lobby, staring at a canvas that made his heart stop. It was a portrait of him, painted in the same style Emma had used for all her work. But this wasn't a copy of an old painting. This was new, detailed, perfect. I don't remember painting this, Anna whispered. But my hands knew exactly what to do. Every brushstroke, every color. Like I'd painted you 1,000 times before. Michael stepped closer, recognizing not just his own face, but the expression Emma had always claimed to see when he looked at her. Love mixed with wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she was real. Anna, that's not my name, is it? She turned to face him, tears streaming down her cheeks. I keep having these flashes of memory. A man who looked like you, telling me he loved me. Hands that felt like yours, holding me while I cried. But then there's this wall in my mind, and everything goes dark. Michael reached out slowly, the way he might approach a wounded animal. What do you remember? Pain. Being held down while someone forced pills down my throat. Voices telling me that everyone I'd ever loved was dead, that I was sick, that I needed to forget. Anna's voice broke, but I couldn't forget completely. Something inside me kept fighting back. Michael pulled her into his arms, and for a moment, she felt exactly like Emma had. The same height, the same way of fitting against his chest, the same scent of paint, and something indefinably her. I'm going to help you remember, he said. All of it. I promise. But even as he made the promise, Michael knew that Richard Collins wouldn't let them reunite without a fight. And some battles came with a price that might be too high for either of them to pay. Anna stared at the painting for 3 hours before she found the courage to touch it. Michael had left reluctantly. Only after she'd convinced him she needed time alone to process whatever was happening in her mind. The flashes of memory were coming faster now, triggered by the familiar weight of his arms around her, the sound of his voice saying her name like a prayer. But there was something else, something hidden in the theater that kept calling to her, pulling her toward the section of wall where she'd found the letters. Anna picked up a crowbar from Michael's toolbox and began carefully prying away more of the old plaster. Behind the third panel, her fingers found something that wasn't paper. It was a small jewelry box, the kind used for engagement rings. The velvet had faded to gray, but the hinges still worked smoothly when she opened it. Inside was a ring she recognized with a clarity that hit her like a physical blow. White gold band, simple solitaire diamond, tiny inscription inside that read, "Forever Emma, M." The moment her fingers touched the metal, the wall in her mind didn't just crack. It shattered. Emma Rose Collins, 22 years old, art student, madly in love with a man named Michael Thompson who built beautiful buildings and made her laugh until her stomach hurt. The night he'd proposed in this very theater, when it was still open and they'd snuck in after hours to paint a mural together. The way he'd hidden the ring in her paint box and waited for her to find it. The memory crashed over her with devastating force, followed immediately by everything that came after. The car accident that wasn't an accident. Waking up in a private medical facility with no idea how she'd gotten there. Uncle Richard's voice, gentle but implacable, explaining that Michael was dead, that she'd been in a coma for months, that her grief had caused a complete mental breakdown. The pills that made thinking feel like swimming through honey. The nurses who held her down when she fought them. The doctors who assured her that the memories of Michael were delusions, side effects of her head injury, that accepting reality was the only path to recovery. Years of chemical fog punctuated by moments of devastating clarity when the medication wore off. Desperate attempts to escape that always ended the same way. More drugs, stricter supervision, gentle voices explaining that she was sick, that the outside world would be too much for someone in her condition. Until 6 months ago, when a new nurse named Sarah had looked at Emma's medical files and realized what was really happening. Sarah, who'd helped her escape during a shift change, who'd given her enough money to disappear and a warning that the Collins family would never stop looking for her. Emma collapsed to her knees in the theater lobby, overwhelmed by the weight of 8 stolen years. She remembered everything now. Michael's face when she'd said yes to his proposal. The the taste of champagne they'd shared afterward, the plans they'd made for a small wedding in his grandmother's garden. And she remembered the last thing she'd said to him before the accident. "I love you, but my family will never accept us. Maybe we should wait." She'd been afraid of their disapproval, afraid of being cut off from her inheritance. She'd never imagined they would take the choice away from her entirely. Emma clutched the ring to her chest, tears streaming down her face as she understood the full scope of what her family had done. They hadn't just stolen her money. They'd stolen her entire life, convinced her that the man she loved was dead while he spent 8 years believing she was the one who died. But now they'd found each other again, and she knew exactly what her family would do about it. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "We know you remember, Emma. Come home quietly, and Michael won't be hurt." Emma's blood turned to ice. They'd been watching. Of course they'd been watching. The Collins family didn't leave anything to chance, especially not $57 million and the exposure of a decades-long conspiracy. She dialed Michael's number with shaking fingers, but the call went straight to voicemail. She tried again. Same result. Either his phone was off, or someone had made sure he couldn't answer. Emma forced herself to think clearly despite the panic clawing at her chest. If she went back to her family, they would drug her again, maybe permanently this time. But if she didn't, they would hurt Michael to force her compliance. They'd already proven they were capable of anything. The theater's back exit led to an alley where she'd parked her car. Emma grabbed her painting supplies and the letters she'd found, leaving everything else behind. She couldn't go back to her apartment, couldn't contact any of the few friends she'd made as Anna Foster. Her family had resources, connections, and 8 years of practice at making people disappear. But she had something they didn't expect. She remembered who she was now, and Emma Collins had never backed down from a fight. The drive to Lisa Martinez's office took 20 minutes through downtown traffic. Emma had found the investigator's business card in Michael's jacket pocket and memorized the address. If Michael trusted Lisa enough to hire her, then maybe Lisa could help both of them survive what was coming. Lisa's office was dark, but Emma could see light coming from under the door. She climbed the stairs 2 at a time, her heart pounding with the knowledge that every second mattered now. She knocked softly. "Lisa? It's Anna Foster, Michael Thompson's friend." The door opened to reveal Lisa Martinez pointing a gun at Emma's chest. Behind her, 2 men in expensive suits sat in chairs that hadn't been there during Michael's visit. "Hello, Emma." Richard Collins stepped out of the shadows, looking exactly as she remembered him. "We've been waiting for you to come home." Emma took a step backward, but there was nowhere to run. The stairway was blocked, and the window was 3 stories up over concrete. "Where's Michael?" "Safe. For now." Richard nodded to the men, who stood up with the fluid movements of professionals. "But his continued safety depends entirely on your cooperation." "What do you want?" "The same thing I've always wanted. To protect this family's reputation and assets." Richard's voice carried the same patient tone he'd used to explain her medication schedule for 8 years. "You're going to come home, Emma. You're going to resume your treatment. And you're going to forget all about Michael Thompson. Never. Then he'll have an accident. A very tragic, very public accident that will leave no room for questions about what happened." Richard pulled out his phone and showed her a photo of Michael tied to a chair in what looked like a warehouse. "The choice is yours, just like it's always been." Emma stared at the photo, seeing the man she loved bruised but alive, and realized that some choices weren't really choices at all. She'd already lost 8 years to protect people she cared about. She couldn't lose Michael too. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll come with you." But as the men moved to escort her from the office, Emma palmed the small paring knife she'd been using to scrape paint from the theater walls. Her family had taught her to be helpless, but they'd forgotten that Emma Collins had always been a fighter. They were about to remember. Michael came to with blood in his mouth and the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. The warehouse smelled like rust and motor oil, with undertones of something that might have been fear. His hands were zip-tied to a metal chair that had seen better decades, and his left eye was swollen shut from whatever Richard Collins' men had used to convince him to get in their car. The last thing he remembered was leaving the theater and walking to his truck. Then a blow to the back of his head and the world going dark. Now he was here, wherever here was, waiting for whatever came next. Footsteps echoed across concrete. Michael lifted his head as Richard Collins emerged from the shadows. looking like he was attending a board meeting instead of supervising a kidnapping. "You're awake. Good." Richard pulled up a folding chair and sat down with the casual precision of someone who'd done this before. "We need to discuss your future, Michael. Or rather, whether you're going to have one." "Where's Emma?" "Safe. Which is more than I can say for you at the moment." Richard checked his watch like he had somewhere important to be. "She's agreed to come home, resume her treatment, and forget this unfortunate episode ever happened." Michael tested the zip ties holding his wrists. Industrial strength, cutting into his skin when he pulled against them. "She'll never agree to that. She already has. Amazing what people will do when properly motivated." Richard's smile belonged in a morgue. Emma always was sentimental about lost causes. The warehouse door opened with a screech of rusted hinges. One of Richard's men walked in, spoke quietly into the older man's ear, then disappeared back into the darkness. Richard's expression shifted from confident to concerned. "It seems we have a problem." Before Michael could ask what kind of problem, the sound of gunfire erupted from somewhere outside the warehouse. Shouts, running footsteps, more gunshots. Richard stood up so fast his chair fell over. "Sir." The voice belonged to someone trying very hard not to sound panicked. "Deal with it," Richard snapped. "And get Collins here. Now." But the warehouse door burst open before anyone could move. Lisa Martinez stepped through with a shotgun in her hands and the expression of someone who'd run out of patience for games. "Seattle Police," she shouted, though Michael was pretty sure Lisa didn't work for the police. "Everyone on the ground." Richard reached for something inside his jacket, but Lisa swung the shotgun toward him with practiced ease. "I wouldn't if I were you. You have no authority here." "Funny thing about kidnapping," Lisa said conversationally. "It tends to give people all kinds of authority they didn't have before." She moved closer to Michael, keeping the gun trained on Richard. "You okay?" "I'll live. Where's Emma?" "That's complicated." The warehouse lights flickered on, revealing the space was larger than Michael had realized. Concrete floors, exposed ceiling beams, and enough shadows to hide an army. But what caught his attention was the sound of more footsteps, these coming from deeper inside the building. Emma walked out of the darkness with blood on her hands and determination in her eyes. She was followed by 3 men in handcuffs, one of whom was bleeding from what looked like a knife wound in his shoulder. Behind them came actual Seattle police officers, including a detective Michael recognized from newspaper photos. "Hello, Uncle Richard." Emma's voice carried 8 years of suppressed rage. "We need to talk." Richard stared at his niece like she was a ghost that had forgotten to stay dead. "Emma, you're supposed to be drugged unconscious in the back of a van." Emma held up a small paring knife, its blade stained red. "Your men underestimated me. Again." Detective Sarah Chun stepped forward with handcuffs ready. "Richard Collins, you're under arrest for kidnapping, fraud, conspiracy, and about 12 other charges we'll figure out later." "This is ridiculous. I demand to speak to my lawyer." "You'll get your phone call." Chun snapped the cuffs around Richard's wrists with more force than strictly necessary. "Right after we sort through the interesting documents we found at your house." Lisa moved behind Michael and cut his zip ties with a knife that appeared from somewhere in her jacket. "How did you find us?" "Emma called me from your office," Chun said. "Told me she was Emma Collins, that her death had been faked, and that her family was holding someone hostage. Normally I'd think that was a crank call, but she had details about her own case that were never made public." Michael rubbed his wrists where the plastic had cut into skin, trying to process everything that was happening. "Emma called you after I stabbed my way out of that van." Emma knelt beside his chair, her hands gentle as she examined his injuries. "They made a mistake, Michael. They assumed I was still the scared girl they'd been drugging for 8 years. What happened to the men who took you?" Emma's smile had sharp edges. "Let's just say they won't be working in private security anymore." Detective Chun was reading Richard his rights, but the man seemed more focused on Emma than on his impending legal troubles. "You don't understand what you're doing. This family has responsibilities, obligations. The money. The money you stole?" Emma stood up, putting herself between Richard and Michael. "The trust fund you've been using for your own business ventures while keeping me drugged in a private medical facility? That money was meant to protect you from making foolish decisions, like falling in love with someone you didn't approve of." Richard's mask finally slipped completely, like throwing away everything your grandmother built for some working-class nobody who couldn't give you the life you deserved. "He gave me the only life I ever wanted." Emma's voice carried a finality that made everyone in the warehouse pay attention. And you stole it from both of us. Detective Chun led Richard toward the exit, but he turned back one more time. This won't end here, Emma. The family has resources you can't imagine. The family is finished. Emma pulled a folder from her jacket, the same one Michael had brought to Lisa's office. Every forged document, every fraudulent bank transfer, every bribe you paid to keep doctors quiet. Lisa found it all, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows what the Collins family really is. After Richard and his men were gone, the warehouse felt enormous and quiet. Michael stood up slowly, testing his balance against the pain in his head. Emma was there immediately, her arms around him like she was afraid he might disappear. I remembered everything, she whispered against his chest. The proposal, the ring, all of it. But Michael, I also remembered the last thing I said to you before the accident. Emma, I was scared of my family's reaction. I wanted to wait, to find a way to make them accept us. She pulled back to look at him, tears streaming down her face. I was such a coward. You were 22 years old, and none of this was your fault. I wasted so much time. 8 years we could have had together. Michael cupped her face in his hands, feeling the scar that marked what her family had done to her. We have now. That's what matters. Lisa cleared her throat from across the warehouse. I hate to interrupt the reunion, but we should probably get out of here. Richard Collins might be in custody, but he wasn't lying about the family having resources. Emma nodded, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. There's something else. The trust fund my grandmother set up? It's not just $57 million. When I turn 30 next month, there are additional assets that transfer. Property, investments, controlling interest in the Collins Foundation. How much are we talking about? Close to $200 million. Emma's smile was fierce with anticipation. Enough to rebuild everything they destroyed and maybe help some other people in the process. As they walked out of the warehouse together, Michael realized that Emma was right. They couldn't get back the 8 years that had been stolen from them, but they could make sure the time they had left counted for something. And if the Collins family wanted a war over what remained of their empire, they were about to discover that Emma Rose Collins had learned a few things about fighting during her years in captivity. Some lessons, Michael thought as he watched her plan their next move, were worth whatever they cost to learn. 6 months later, Emma stood in the lobby of the Riverside Theater and watched sunlight stream through windows that hadn't been cleaned in a decade. The restoration was nearly complete, but it looked nothing like the plans Michael had originally drawn up. Instead of a traditional renovation, they'd transformed the space into something entirely new. The murals Emma had discovered were now the centerpiece of what would become Seattle's first community arts center, funded by the Collins Foundation Trust that she'd reclaimed after months of legal battles. The contractor says we can have the opening next week, Michael said, coming up behind her with paint in his hair and satisfaction in his voice. Assuming the city inspector doesn't find any more mysterious requirements. Emma leaned back against his chest, marveling at how natural it felt after all this time. Richard's lawyer is still trying to delay the final paperwork on the foundation transfer. Let him try? Detective Chun said the federal charges alone will keep your uncle busy for the next 20 years. The legal aftermath had been brutal and public. Richard Collins and his associates faced charges ranging from kidnapping and fraud to conspiracy and money laundering. The private medical facility where Emma had been held was shut down, and 3 other patients who'd been held against their will were finally reunited with their families. The scandal had destroyed the Collins family's reputation completely, which was exactly what Emma had wanted. Michael. Emma turned in his arms, studying his face with the same wonder she'd felt 8 years ago. Do you ever think about what we would have been doing right now if none of this had happened? Sometimes. He tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his touch gentle against the scar that was barely visible now. But then I think about who we are now, and I'm not sure I'd change it. Even the 8 years we lost. Especially those. Michael's voice was serious, the way it got when he was trying to explain something important. Emma, the woman I fell in love with, was brave and beautiful and full of dreams. But she was also young and scared of disappointing people. The woman standing here now? She fought her way out of hell and came back stronger. Emma felt tears prick her eyes, but they were good tears this time. I love you too, you know. I was hoping you'd say that. Michael stepped back and pulled something from his pocket. The engagement ring she'd found in the theater wall, cleaned and polished, but otherwise exactly the same as the day he'd proposed. Because I have a question to ask you. Michael Thompson, if you get down on one knee in this dusty theater, I'm going to cry all over your clean shirt. I was planning on it. He dropped to one knee anyway, holding the ring up like an offering. Emma Rose Collins, will you marry me? Again? For the first time? I'm not sure what the proper protocol is here. Yes. The word came out as a laugh mixed with a sob. Yes to all of it. The ring slid onto her finger like it had never left, and Emma realized that some things really were worth waiting for, even when the waiting wasn't a choice. They were married 3 weeks later in the garden behind Michael's grandmother's house, exactly as they'd planned 8 years before. Emma wore her grandmother's dress, which had been carefully preserved in storage while she was missing. Michael wore the same suit he'd bought for their original wedding date, still hanging in his closet like a promise he'd refused to break. The guest list was small but perfect. Lisa Martinez stood as Emma's maid of honor. Detective Chun represented the Seattle Police Department, and even some of the other patients from the medical facility attended with their families. Mrs. Chun from Michael's building brought enough food to feed half the neighborhood, and his 92-year-old grandmother gave a toast that made everyone cry. To second chances, the old woman said, raising her glass of champagne, and to love that's strong enough to survive anything. The reception was held at the newly opened Riverside Community Arts Center, where Emma's restored murals told the story of their hidden romance to anyone who knew how to read the symbols. Local artists displayed their work in the galleries. Children from the neighborhood attended free art classes in the studios, and the main theater hosted performances by groups that couldn't afford traditional venues. It was everything Emma had dreamed of when she'd first started painting, and everything Michael had wanted to build when he'd first become an architect. I have something for you, Emma said as they danced to music played by a string quartet of teenagers from the center's music program. She handed him a small wrapped package. Inside was a key made of brushed silver, attached to a keychain that read home. It's for the house. Michael stopped dancing. What house? The one I bought for us. With my own money, from my own account, without asking permission from anyone. Emma's smile was radiant with the freedom of making her own choices. It has a studio for me, a workshop for you, and enough bedrooms for all the kids we're going to have. How many kids are we going to have? I'm thinking 3, maybe 4. I have 8 years of loving to make up for. Michael spun her around until she laughed, the sound echoing off the restored ceiling like music. I love you, Emma Thompson. I love you too, Michael Thompson. As the evening wound down and their guests began to leave, Emma and Michael found themselves alone in the theater lobby where they'd first found each other again. The murals glowed in the soft lighting, telling the story of a love that had survived separation, betrayal, and 8 years of believing the other was dead. Do you think we'll be happy? Emma asked, settling into the circle of Michael's arms. I think we already are. Outside, Seattle sparkled with the lights of a city full of people pursuing their own dreams and fighting their own battles. Some would win, some would lose, and some would discover that the victory looked different than they'd expected. But inside the Riverside Theater, 2 people who'd found their way back to each other despite impossible odds stood surrounded by art that celebrated the power of love to endure anything. Emma looked up at the mural where she'd hidden their initials 8 years ago, when she'd been young and scared and desperate to leave some record of what she felt. Now those same initials were carved into wedding rings and written on legal documents that would let them build the life they'd always wanted. Thank you, she whispered to the painted figures dancing around their harvest moon. Michael followed her gaze to the mural, understanding without words what she was thinking. The younger version of herself who'd been brave enough to love him despite her family's disapproval. The faith that had kept both of them believing in something worth fighting for. The second chance that had seemed impossible, but turned out to be inevitable. Come on, Mrs. Thompson, he said, taking her hand and leading her toward the door. Let's go home. And as they walked out of the theater together, Emma realized that home wasn't a place they were going to. It was something they carried with them, something that had survived 8 years of separation and would last for all the years ahead. Some love stories, she thought as Michael helped her into their car, were worth whatever they cost to tell. And some happy endings were worth waiting for, even when the waiting nearly broke you. Especially then. The Riverside Theater stood quiet in the Seattle night, its windows glowing with promise for all the stories yet to be told within its walls. And somewhere in the restored murals, hidden symbols continued to whisper the truth that Emma and Michael had learned. Love endures. Love survives. Love finds a way. Always. The sound of children's laughter drifted through the open windows of the house on Magnolia Bluff as Emma finished the last brushstroke on her latest painting. The canvas showed the Seattle skyline at sunset, but with small details that told a different story. A couple dancing on a theater rooftop, wedding rings glinting in the painted light, and tiny figures that looked suspiciously like the Thompson family. "Mama, look what I made." Emma turned to find her 4-year-old daughter, Grace, holding up a finger painting that appeared to be either a rainbow or the aftermath of a crayon explosion. Grace had inherited Emma's artistic tendencies, but not yet her sense of color coordination. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." "What is it?" "It's Daddy building our treehouse, and you painting, and baby James sleeping, and me being the best artist in the whole world." Emma laughed, scooping Grace into a paint-stained hug. "You definitely are. Should we go show Daddy?" They found Michael in the backyard, tools scattered around him as he worked on the promised treehouse with the focused determination of someone who discovered that parenting involved a lot more engineering than architecture school had prepared him for. Baby James slept peacefully in his carrier, despite the sound of hammering and his sister's enthusiastic commentary on everything. "How's it coming?" Emma asked, settling onto the grass with Grace curled against her side. "Ask me again when I figure out how to make the roof stay attached." Michael wiped sweat from his forehead, leaving a streak of sawdust behind. "Grace has very specific requirements for the structural integrity of her future art studio. It has to be strong enough for tea parties," Grace announced solemnly. "And painting. And maybe dragons if they're friendly ones." "Definitely dragons," Michael agreed with the gravity the topic deserved. "Can't have a proper treehouse without dragon accommodation." Emma watched her husband explain the finer points of dragon-proofing to their daughter and felt the familiar flutter of amazement that this was her life. 5 years ago, she'd been a woman without a past, working alone in a theater and fighting to remember who she was. Now she was surrounded by the family she dreamed of as a young woman, living in a house filled with art and laughter and the beautiful chaos of everyday happiness. The Riverside Community Arts Center had become exactly what they'd hoped. Local newspapers called it a success story, but Emma thought of it more as proof that good things could grow from terrible circumstances. The center served over 300 families now, offering everything from art classes to job training programs. The performance space hosted weddings, graduations, and community meetings along with the original theater productions. More importantly, it had become a place where people came to heal. Emma had met dozens of families over the years who'd been touched by trauma, loss, or simply the ordinary struggles of making a life in an expensive city. The center gave them somewhere to create beauty from pain, to find community when they felt isolated, and to discover that art could be a bridge between who they were and who they wanted to become. The legal aftermath of the Collins family scandal had finally concluded the previous year. Richard Collins received 25 years in federal prison, along with his associates. The private medical facility was permanently closed, and new legislation made it much harder for families to commit relatives without proper oversight. Emma had testified at 3 different trials, each time feeling stronger and more certain that speaking the truth had been worth whatever it cost. The Collins Foundation now funded arts programs, victim advocacy groups, and research into ethical treatment for people with mental health challenges. Emma had discovered that using her family's money to help other people heal was far more satisfying than anything her grandmother's trust fund could have bought. "Emma." Michael's voice pulled her back to the present. Phone's ringing. She went inside to answer, recognizing Lisa Martinez's number. Lisa had opened her own investigation firm specializing in missing persons cases, often working pro bono for families who couldn't afford traditional services. "I wanted to give you an update on the Henderson case," Lisa said without preamble. "We found their daughter. She's alive, and she's coming home." Emma felt the familiar mixture of joy and relief that came with every successful case. "That's wonderful news. Couldn't have done it without the techniques we developed on your case. Funny how one investigation can change the way you approach all the others." After they hung up, Emma stood in her kitchen and looked out at her family in the backyard. Michael had given up on the treehouse for the moment, and was now pushing Grace on the swing he'd built last summer. Baby James was awake, making the small noises that meant he was hungry and would be loudly expressing that opinion very soon. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in an ordinary American suburb, the kind of life that millions of people lived without thinking twice about it. But Emma never forgot how extraordinary ordinary could be when you'd lived without it for so long. Her phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, the nurse who'd helped her escape from the medical facility. Sarah was getting married next month, and Emma and Michael were invited to the wedding. The message included a photo of Sarah in her wedding dress, radiant with the same happiness Emma remembered feeling on her own wedding day. "Some stories end happily," Emma texted back. "Yours is going to be beautiful." As evening settled over Seattle, the Thompson family gathered around their dinner table in the house Emma had bought with her own choices and her own money. Grace told elaborate stories about the adventures she planned to have in her treehouse. Michael discussed the school they were designing for underserved communities. Baby James managed to get more food on himself than in his mouth, which everyone agreed was an impressive accomplishment for someone not yet walking. Later, after the children were asleep and the dishes were done, Emma and Michael sat on their porch swing and watched the lights of the city spread out below them. The Riverside Theater was visible in the distance, glowing softly in the darkness like a beacon for other people who needed to find their way home. "Do you ever miss it?" Michael asked. "The drama, the intensity, the feeling that everything was at stake all the time." Emma considered the question seriously. "I miss feeling like I was fighting for something important. But then I realize I still am. Just in a different way." "How so?" "Every day we choose to be happy. We're fighting against everything that tried to destroy us. Every time Grace laughs, every time James reaches a new milestone, every time you kiss me good morning, we're proving that love really can survive anything." Emma curled closer to him on the swing. "That feels pretty important to me." Michael was quiet for a moment. Then, "I love you, Emma Thompson." "I love you too, Michael Thompson." The words were simple, ordinary, the kind of thing married couples said to each other every day. But Emma never said them without remembering the 8 years when she'd thought she'd never have the chance to say them again. Some love stories, she'd learned, were worth whatever they cost to live. And some happy endings were just the beginning.